Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tip of the Iceberg Live, brought to you as always by Inside the Penguins, a proud affiliate of the Hockey News. Also, your home for Pittsburgh Penguins news and analysis. Remember, you can find us on YouTube at Inside the Penguins or anywhere you get your podcast from. Got a good show for you guys today. Obviously, had a lot of fun talking with Nick Horwat earlier today on a full episode of the Tip of the Iceberg. A little bit about Jesse Puljujärvi, a little bit about the man I'm going to talk about here in about 5 to 10 minutes, former Pittsburgh Penguins head coach that is back in the National Hockey League, and also wrapping up the World Championships over in Czechia. So if you haven't heard any of that, go check that out on this channel as well. But let's start off today talking a little bit about extensions, because contract season is getting ready to kick into high gear as soon as the Stanley Cup playoffs come to an end, and a lot of people are focused on Sidney Crosby's contract, and for good reason, right? He is a Hall of Famer. He is the savior in the city of Pittsburgh, and he is entering a contract year in the 2024-25 season. So it's reasonable that a lot of people are keeping their eyes on Sidney Crosby and his contract conversations, but nothing new has come out on that front since really early in this offseason, directly after the Penguins season came to an end. Elliot Friedman of Sportsnet and 32 Thoughts talked a little bit about his contract and saying that it could come in the ballpark somewhere between 3 years and $10.5 million. But again, that was more so, from the sounds of it, a guess, an assumption, and we haven't really heard anything since then. So no new news pertaining to the Sidney Crosby contract as of right now. But odds are that question gets answered in a little over a month, shortly after the July 1st deadline, whenever that window for a contract extension opens for Sidney Crosby. But the Penguins, a team that didn't really sign a lot of extensions this season. Kyle Dubas played it close to the vest, didn't make a lot of moves mid-season when it comes to extending players beyond the current season. Has two players going into next year, besides Sidney Crosby, that will also have their windows opened up on July 1st to sign a potential extension: Marcus Pettersson and Drew O'Connor. Let's talk about Pettersson first, because I think that this is going to be an interesting storyline to monitor as the season continues and as the offseason continues, because while O'Connor's contract probably doesn't get touched this summer, he is coming off a contract year, but I think the Penguins would likely wait on him a little bit until next season begins to see how he responds to having the year that he did this past year. Pettersson is a guy that you know exactly what he's going to bring. You know what he has brought to your team over the past couple of seasons, and that has been nothing short of spectacular defensive play from the Swedish defenseman. Now, he is the best defensive defenseman on the Penguins roster. He was the best defensive defenseman on their roster last season, and you can make an argument that he's been their best defensive defenseman for the past 3+ seasons in Pittsburgh. But he will be 29 years old when this contract comes to an end at the end of next year. So that opens up the question of, what does he want, and what are the Penguins willing to cough up to lock down Marcus Pettersson for the foreseeable future? You would imagine that this is Pettersson's last chance to cash in big on a contract. I would doubt that the Penguins would want to feed him an 8-year contract. They didn't really want to do it with Jake Gensel this past season at around the same age, so I would assume that they're not looking to give that to Marcus Pettersson. So the question becomes, what does Pettersson look for his last big money contract, and are the Penguins going to be willing to give that to him? That's going to be a big situation to monitor after July 1st and as the summer rolls on, especially once we see how the Penguins address their blue line this summer, because as of right now, they have a lot of names signed. Pettersson is signed for next season. So too is Erik Karlsson, who has, I believe, 3 years left on his contract. So too is Chris Letang, who has 4 years remaining on his contract. So too does now Drew O'Connor, who signed a 3-year extension, and Ryan Graves, who has 5 years left on that very long deal. So what will the Penguins do to try to reshape this defense? Because I think we can all agree they need to at least have a little bit of a new look going into next season. They need to try something new going into next season, because firing Todd Reirden is simply not going to be enough. So what do they end up doing, and how does that affect the contract negotiations between them and Marcus Pettersson? Certainly one of the biggest names to watch, one of the biggest storylines to watch once July 1st hits, and once especially July 1st and the fallout of July 1st starts to unravel, what does that look like for the Pittsburgh Penguins? And what does Marcus Pettersson want to do in response during his contract negotiations? The other player I mentioned here is Drew O'Connor. Now, Drew O'Connor last offseason was in a similar position. He was a restricted free agent. He was looking to continue to build on what had been a slow build at the NHL level. He ended up taking the Penguins to arbitration, but fortunately signing that contract right before they actually had to go to the hearing. So he avoided the arbitration hearing, but he did prolong his contract negotiations throughout the summer, and indeed was the last Pittsburgh Penguin free agent to sign a contract last offseason, and for good reason. He felt that he could take his game to another level, and that's exactly what he did when the season started. He ended up becoming an everyday NHLer, and beyond that, he ended up having a career season and being a breakout star for the Pittsburgh Penguins in their middle six and playing some top 6 minutes, playing some top line minutes alongside Sidney Crosby, and bringing a really good speed game that follows up with some transition and follows up with some forechecking. And by the end of the season, he started to find his game and started to find that finishing ability that we've seen Drew O'Connor have in spurts throughout his career to this point, but he hadn't been able to put it all quite together. Now you see what he's able to do in a breakout year: 16 goals, 33 points, and he has that 1 year left on his current contract. Like I said, the Penguins are likely to allow this guy to walk into the season on a contract year and want him to prove that he is going to be able to build off of what he did last year, and that wasn't just a one-season wonder. You want to see him build on that. You want to see him perhaps start the season in the bottom six to see if he can do it alongside a center like a Lars Eller, maybe another third-line center that they bring in, and not just that he is a product of guys like of Evgeny Malkin, of guys like a Sidney Crosby. I think the talent is there. Personally, from what I saw last year, I believe the talent is there for Drew O'Connor to be a pivotal piece in this lineup for the foreseeable future. But the question is going to be, what does that number come in at? Because the good thing for the Penguins is they're looking to get younger. And part of that is going to be a guy like Drew O'Connor, who's going to be 26 years old by the time this contract comes up, that he could be that transitional at the very beginning of his prime type of player that is going to be able to buoy the top six as the bottom guys, Braden, Yager, Veli Koivunen, Vasily Ponomarev, get into the lineup and start to get their feet wet at the National Hockey League level. O'Connor provides that completed product, which is where a lot of these other guys have a lot of road to build to get to that point. So I'm interested to see how that eventual contract negotiation takes shape. Like I mentioned, I would presume that they're going to let it go throughout the entirety of this summer. They're going to let him walk into the season on a contract year. And I would think that they're going to look at that first month or so and really have a close eye on Drew O'Connor to see, okay, should we open up contract negotiations now, or should we let this season play out and get to a point where you're going into the offseason needing to sign Drew O'Connor? They didn't make, like I mentioned, a lot of moves during the season this past season, but at the same time, with guys like Pettersson, with guys like O'Connor, it might be best to lock them up before they go into next year, because Pettersson's coming off of a career year when it comes to scoring points, and his defense was just as impressive as it has ever been. O'Connor's coming off of a career year as well. You might be buying high at this point, but that price might only get elevated if you let it go throughout next season. So like I said, I expect Pettersson to end up being a contract negotiation that takes place this summer. And I expect a guy like Drew O'Connor to be a contract negotiation that they wait on a little bit to see what he looks like at the start of next season. Before we go to your questions, which thank you to everybody that is tuned in here live on Inside the Penguins on YouTube, do want to bring up the big story of the day surrounding the Pittsburgh Penguins. That is former Pittsburgh Penguins head coach Dan Bylsma being hired as the second ever head coach of the Seattle Kraken. Bylsma began his head coaching career with the Penguins back in the 2009 season when he took the place of Michel Therrien midway through the year. That was a team that went to the Stanley Cup final in 2008. He took that team and he turned the page around a little bit in the middle of that season, getting them back to where they needed to be to get into the playoffs, and then to also go on a playoff run, capturing the third Stanley Cup in the history of the Pittsburgh Penguins organization. Not only that, he also then went on to become one of the winningest head coaches in Pittsburgh Penguins history, being third all-time in games played behind the net, or behind the bench, and second all-time in wins. He was fired after the 2013-14 season after a couple of disappointing playoff performances by the Penguins. A second-round exit to the New York Rangers was the undoing of him in Pittsburgh. He then became an assistant in Detroit. He then became a head coach of the Coachella Valley Thunderbirds of the AHL, Seattle's AHL team, and then taking that team to a couple of deep Calder Cup runs was exactly what the Seattle Kraken needed to see. He gets named the second head coach in the history of that organization. The coaching carousel, as we talked about this morning, slowing down a little bit. Bylsma going to Seattle. You had Sheldon Keefe earlier in the week, late last week, going to the New Jersey Devils. Obviously, Craig Berube going to the Toronto Maple Leafs. The only position remaining is the head coaching spot of the San Jose Sharks. And there's a lot of big names, I should say, remaining on the market. Will one of those names find their way to Pittsburgh? A name I mentioned this morning, Gerard Gallant, took the year off this past year after being fired by the New York Rangers 2 seasons ago, midway through the year. Does he end up wanting to come back and coach at the National Hockey League level? And if he does, there might not be a better position than being an assistant coach in Pittsburgh, because while Mike Sullivan does seem to be very consistent and very steady in where he is at the moment, there hasn't been a lot of success. And sometimes, if that success continues to flounder, maybe Mike Sullivan ends up on the hot seat eventually. He's not there right now, but maybe he does. And having a guy like Gerard Gallant behind him will certainly light a fire under Mike Sullivan a little bit going into next season. That's what I'd like to see. But then again, there's guys like David Quinn that are out there. Obviously, he has the connections to Mike Sullivan, so we'll see if he ends up being a name that is brought in. But at the end of the day, the big story today, former Penguins head coach Dan Bylsma back in the NHL as a head coach. Didn't work towards the tail end in Pittsburgh. Did not work at all as a head coach of the Buffalo Sabres. But then again, can you really blame him at that point? The Buffalo Sabres have been a troubled organization, to say the least, over the past decade. So congratulations to Coach Bylsma. It'll be interesting to see if he can get that Seattle Kraken team back into the postseason where they were in their second ever season. Let's talk about some of these questions that everybody has in here, and get your questions in if you want them to be answered here in the next 10 to 15 minutes on Tip of the Ice-Burgh Live. But thank you to everybody that is tuned in currently live on Inside the Penguins on YouTube. Let's start with Eric, who goes back to the Sidney Crosby extension and says, why does everyone think Sid is going to want a pay increase? My guess is he'll take 3 years at the same AAV or less, like Evgeny Malkin and like Chris Letang did. Does he deserve a raise? Yes, but I don't think he asks for one. Here's the thing that I would throw back to you, Eric, because I agree that there's, in the back of my mind, the thought that it's Sidney Crosby. He's taken a hometown discount his entire career, but at the same time, he signed this contract a long time ago. And where the NHL salary cap was at when he signed it is a lot further back than where it's at now. And that's even after a pandemic when the salary cap stayed flat for a handful of years. With the cap going up substantially this year and then expected to likely go up substantially again next year, even if he takes a $1.3 million pay increase, it's going to be a pay cut compared to what he probably deserves. So if it's 3 years and $10 million, and that is indeed the number for Sidney Crosby, I wouldn't consider it that much of an increase. I would consider it not even him being paid probably what he's worth, because you look at what Sidney Crosby was able to do this season with the bad power play, mind you. If they can figure that out next season, there's a chance he goes up over the 100-point mark once again. I certainly wouldn't count it out. So I understand where you're coming from. Sidney Crosby is one of the most, if not the most superstitious players in the National Hockey League. But at the same time, it comes down to being paid what you're worth. And that $8.7 million, he's going to be worth way more than that next season. And he's probably going to be worth way more than that the following couple of seasons. So I would not be surprised if he took that little bit of a pay increase. But like you mentioned, Evgeny Malkin, he went from 9.5 down to 6.1. Chris Letang, I'm trying to remember what he was at. I think he was at 6.75 and went down to 6.1 as well. Those two guys took pay decreases. but I think there is a different level when you get to Sidney Crosby. And I think even if he takes that 1.5, which again is the only number we've heard come out, is that $10 million to $10.5 million number, I still think that would still be taking a hometown discount for the Pittsburgh Penguins if they do indeed get him under contract at that number. Braden Burgard says, do you think the Pens will be involved in the Marty Necas sweepstakes? Marty Necas, now a gold medalist for Team Czechia. Let me look up what his stats were this past season and what his contract situation is, because obviously he's a restricted free agent with the Carolina Hurricanes, and the Hurricanes are in a situation right now that they're not going to be able to bring everybody back, right? They might want to try to re-sign Jake Guentzel, but that's going to cost upwards of $9 million a year. Marty Necas has been a huge part of their team the past couple of seasons, but that's going to cost them an arm and a leg because he has had a lot of success and he's still only 25 years of age. Also, Brady Shea is going to be a free agent this summer. Are they going to be able to bring back one of their biggest pieces on the blue line? So there's a lot of decisions to be made by presumably Eric Tulsky, the interim general manager of the Carolina Hurricanes. You look at what Marty Necas had on his contract the last couple of seasons, and he was making $3 million the last 2 years with the Carolina Hurricanes. And like we said, he has a lot of talent, scoring 24 goals and 53 points in 77 games for the Carolina Hurricanes this season. But it was interesting because I was watching what Necas was doing in the playoffs, because obviously, as with all Penguins followers, all Penguins writers, all Penguins fans, they were keeping a close eye on Jake Guentzel and the Carolina Hurricanes, if not for any other reason than the fate of the Penguins' first overall pick, at least this year, first round pick, I should say, this year. And I was surprised at how little Marty Necas was involved to a certain extent in this new formed Carolina Hurricanes team. So there have been reports that he might be the guy that they end up not tendering a qualifying offer to. He might be the guy that they're looking to trade before free agency so a team can have his rights and just negotiate with him before he potentially goes to the free market if the Hurricanes end up not bringing him back as a restricted free agent. The question becomes, does he fit with the Pittsburgh Penguins? And when you look at Marty Necas, 25 years old, 6'2", 189, and a power play mastermind. You look at what he's able to do on the power play. He has a great shot, and I think that he is a fit in Pittsburgh. The question is, are the Penguins going to be able to afford him? And I think that's going to be where things get a little bit difficult, because the Penguins, yes, they're going to have the money, but is there going to be a bidding war in the trade market for Marty Necas, at least his rights? That's my question. I don't think the Penguins get involved if it ends up being an offer sheet or trading for his rights as a restricted free agent. But if he ends up finding his way to free agency, unrestricted, I think the Penguins at the very least give a call, because he will be one of the biggest names on the market. And Kyle Dubas has already shown, at the very least, he's going to reach out to those names. He's going to check behind those doors to see what the numbers are like. He might not walk all the way through them, but eventually he might. He did that with Erik Karlsson. He was always in on Erik Karlsson, and he said it during free agency on July 1st when he was talking to the media that, yes, he's contacted the San Jose Sharks about Erik Karlsson. Why would you not when there's a player of that caliber up for grabs? I think it's the same situation here with Marty Necas, a very talented player at a very young age and somebody that would do wonders in the Penguins' middle six, likely the top six. I could see him slotting in as that second line winger with Evgeny Malkin and Michael Bunting, and that line being an absolute, grade A plus an advantage for the Pittsburgh Penguins next season. So I really like the idea of Marty Necas. I think it's going to be one of the bigger names this summer, and the decision that Carolina has obviously is going to be a big impact on it. Do they just not tender him and let him walk to free agency, or do they look to get a trade done before to trade his rights? Let's talk about Team Crusade and what he wants to know about one Braden Yager. The question, does Yager play his 9-game trial this season? I would say that there is a possibility 100%, and I think it's all up to Braden Yager and what he looks like when he comes to camp. I think he is going to be a player that is going to be on the minds of Mike Sullivan, Kyle Dubas, and the entire Penguins coaching staff and front office next season, because he has had a great year for the Moose Jaw Warriors. He's obviously had a pretty decent start to his Memorial Cup, even though the Moose Jaw Warriors have fallen in their first 2 games of the preliminary rounds. Interested to see how he performs later this evening in the final game of the preliminaries, but he has had a great season, regular and postseason, for the Moose Jaw Warriors. And I think if he can build off of that, if he can come in this offseason and build as he has done the past couple of off seasons, I think you can see the Penguins start to give him more and more opportunities as fall camp starts, as it goes along, and give him some chances to play with some NHL talent, i.e. a Lars Eller, i.e. maybe a Valtteri Puustinen, i.e. maybe a guy like a Vasily Ponomarev, maybe a guy like a Ville Koivunen, guys that are going to be on this team when, even if he doesn't make it this season, whenever he eventually does make it, which would be the following season or the year after. I would say it's probably going to happen sooner rather than later, but I think the door is 100% open, Team Crusade, for Yager to play that 9-game trial this upcoming season, especially considering the mindset that it seems like a guy in Kyle Dubas is in going into this offseason. Brandon asks, I feel like Yager has a good chance to potentially make the team this year or next. Where do you think he slots in, if so? The question becomes, do they want him as a center, and is he ready to be a center this season, or do they have to start him at wing? I think the Pittsburgh Penguins would ideally like to start him at center because outside of Sam Poulin and Vasily Ponomarev, they don't really have a lot of high-end talent in the prospect system that can play that center ice position. And even Ponomarev and Poulin, unproven at the National Hockey League level. And also, what is their ceiling? Yager's is going to be a little bit higher than theirs. So they're going to want to probably have him as a center. Is he going to be ready to be a center at the National Hockey League level as early as this fall? I think that's a tough ask for a guy in Braden Yager. But I do think that what you've seen from him and what you've heard from his coaching staff, there's a great piece from Taylor Haas of DK Pittsburgh Sports about what he's been able to build upon this year. And part of that was his 200-foot game. It was a big part of his draft year last season. It's been a bigger part of this season as well, where he's been able to build in that defensive zone while still building on and creating career numbers in the offensive zone. He also, Taylor also talked about, his face-off work with Matt Cullen, and I think that's going to be a big thing as well. The only problem with being an undersized guy, which Braden Yager still is at a very young age, so there's still time for him to bulk up. In that face-off dot, you can get tossed around a little bit. I'm not as concerned about that, but I do know it's a little bit harder to make that transition as a center iceman to the National Hockey League level, especially if you're making the jump directly from junior. So where does he slot in? I think it's more likely if he gets that 9-game sample size, like we talked about with Team Crusade, I think it's more likely that he slots in on the wing. And I think they'd probably start him with, again, whoever they bring it at third line center. If it's Max Domi, I could see it being Domi, Braden Yager, and maybe Drew O'Connor. I think that would be a good start for Yager because O'Connor has been very good at both ends of the ice. So it's not, all offense, no defense. I think that would be a nice mix for Braden Yager. But again, this is all hypotheticals at this point. He still has to come in. He still has to prove it. And he still has to take some strides throughout this summer after his junior season ends with the WHL Moose Jaw Warriors. Austin has a throwback question. I love these. Given the underwhelming 2010s playoff performances, would you reverse any moves for the Pens that could change things and maybe lead to more success? Oh, that is a tough one. That is a great question though, Austin. Would I reverse any moves? I'm trying to think of some of the worst moves that they made, because I certainly wouldn't reverse the Jarome Iginla move, because when you look at what they did there, I understand they only had the post-trade deadline and the playoff run, which they did get to the Eastern Conference Finals, but they got embarrassed by the Boston Bruins back in 2013. But still, Jarome Iginla was a success for the Penguins. Did they give up a lot for him? Yeah, but at the same time, it was Jarome frickin' Iginla. So I'm not going to harp on that one too much. The one move would probably be drafting Derek Pouliot early in that draft, where they took two defensemen, Oli Mata and Derek Pouliot, both, I believe, in the first round. Pouliot was 8th overall, and Mata was a little bit later. Now, Oli Mata has put together a nice career, and Derek Pouliot, for what it's worth, he is a black ace right now for the Dallas Stars. So he might have a Stanley Cup ring on his finger by the end of, the calendar year of 2024. But probably using that high a draft pick, the highest draft pick the Penguins have had, I believe, since 2010. using it on a guy that eventually turned out to be a bust for your team, that's a tough one to swallow. So I would say probably drafting Derek Pouliot in the first round back in, I believe it was 2012, that draft class, if not 2013, if memory serves me correctly. But at the same time, you look at some of the other moves in the 2010s, trading for or signing Ryan Reeves, trading a first round pick for Derek Brassard. That's probably the worst one if you're going to later 2010s, but that's after the cup runs. So, if it's post cup runs in 2016 and 17, probably the Derek Brassard trade is the worst one. Maybe the Jack Johnson contract. And also, maybe it's just the Ryan Graves contract. I know you said throwback question, so I'm trying to give throwback answers, but Ryan Graves' contract has to be high on that list. So that's a couple that I'll give you in that one. JR, keeping me right, says Tanger was up to 7.25 before he took that pay cut, so appreciate that. Gunnar Murphy wants to know, what do you think Valtteri Puustinen's ceiling is? Puustinen's a guy that I've been high on for a pretty long time here because he came in as a 7th round pick. There were low expectations, but the second, and I mean the absolute second he hit the ice at the American Hockey League level, you could tell that he was of a higher level than a lot of the prospects the Penguins had in quite some time. So I've been excited for his emergence. And this year, obviously, we get it. 20 points in 52 or 53 games, only 5 goals. But I think his ceiling, especially on the goal scoring marker, is much higher than that. I could see him being a really good middle six piece for the Pittsburgh Penguins. I don't think that he's a guy that could ever become a bona fide star at the National Hockey League. I just don't think his ceiling is that high. Again, time will tell. He's still a very young player, but at the same time, what I see him being is a very good middle six guy, likely leaning top 6 because he has that much talent, but either a very, very good top of the line, third line winger, or a middle of the road second line guy. I think when you talk about actual stats where he tops out at, I would say he's probably, I could see him popping off for a 60-point season, but I think that's really, really everything has to go right for him. He has to be with the right line mates. He has to have every bounce go his way. So I see him being a 50 to 55 point in general being the ceiling, and 20 to 25 goals. I could certainly see him with the shot that he has and the offensive instincts that he has. I could certainly see him being a 20-goal scorer at the National Hockey League. It didn't come together for him in year 1. He scored only 5 goals, but you saw some of those traces, that really electric shot, that really stellar job at finding some of the soft areas. You saw some of that shine through in his first opportunity at the National Hockey League level. I want to see more of it going forward, but I think if all things go right, he is definitely somebody that has the talent to potentially be a 20-goal scorer, 25-goal scorer at some point in his career. JR has another question here, says, do you see the Penguins going big and offering someone like Sam Reinhart $8 by $10 million, or maybe even Stamkos a $3.7 million contract? Both have 34 and 39 power play points this year during the regular season. Sam Reinhart is a guy that somebody is going to overpay this summer. He's been great this season. I'm not trying to take anything away from the year that Sam Reinhart had. But at the same time, can he replicate that somewhere else? Because the Florida Panthers are a very, very special instance. You look at that team that Bill Zito has put together, and there's a reason that he is up for General Manager of the Year. There's a reason that they are in the Eastern Conference Finals for a second consecutive season. They're stacked. Absolutely, unequivocally stacked. And Sam Reinhart, all credit to him, took the opportunities that he was given on a very good team and had an electrifying year. Somebody's going to overpay for Sam Reinhart. I'm just hoping it's not the Penguins. I think they need to be fine in Pittsburgh, but at the same time, I just obviously don't see the same level of talent that the Florida Panthers have, and I don't know if he could replicate that, specifically if you're paying him for 8 years at $10 million. I would be, of the two, more inclined to sign Steven Stamkos at 3 by 7, because this is a guy that has kind of fought off Father Time, similar to a guy like Sidney Crosby, and a guy that on that left wall has been elite for a decade plus on the power play. Now, the Penguins at this point, adding one other player on the personnel is not going to completely fix it. It needs to be the players that are already in Pittsburgh. I've said that a couple times. I'll continue to say that adding a Steven Stamkos would be great, but Sidney Crosby, Erik Karlsson, Evgeny Malkin, Chris Letang, whoever's out there, they need to figure it out, or else it's not going to matter. If you bring in one guy, that's great. It might automatically raise the ceiling, but they were nowhere near their ceiling last year. They were at their floor last season. They need to find a way to get above that before you start considering one guy being the savior of the Penguins power play. But I do like both of those names. Obviously, both of them are going to be huge storylines to follow this offseason. Again, I would much rather go Stamkos short term, maybe overpay him this year and next, than commit to a guy in Sam Reinhart who has always had the talent, has never been able to put it together, was able to finally put it together on a very, very good team. I don't know if I want to bet on him doing that again whenever the talent around him takes a little bit of a dip. Killhouse says John Marino is the worst trade. That one is up there as well. Mitch says thoughts on Crosby's future. A very generalized question here, which is fine because it gives me a lot of directions to go. Contract-wise, we talked about it. I would not be surprised if he signs that 3-year contract extension on July 1st, to be completely honest. As far as his ability, I saw no signs at all this season of him slowing down, even in his worst time of the year. And he did look really bad around the NHL trade deadline. The whole team did. That felt to be a little bit more mental than physical, if anything. And he proved at the end of the season that even after playing 82 games last year, even after playing every game going up to that point this year, he still had plenty in the tank to carry the Penguins to being very, very close to a playoff spot, which he got a lot of help late down the stretch. But if you look at his numbers, they were above and beyond ridiculous, similar to what you saw from him early in the season. So thoughts on his future? I still see no signs of him slowing down. So I think he's going to continue to be one of the best players in the National Hockey League. I think he's going to continue to get some Hart Trophy recognition throughout the season. We're going to see people say, all right, he's putting the team on his back once again. And I think he finishes top 5 all time in scoring. I've laid out the pace that I set before last season for him to get to top 5. I think he finishes top 5. And in fact, I think he finishes at the very least 4th. I think he passes Ron Francis, and I think he passes Mark Messier as well. So that's my general thoughts on the future. If you had a more specific question, go ahead and toss it in. I'll address that as well. But that's my general thoughts on Sidney Crosby's future. Luke M says, do you think it's possible to move Graves' contract? I think I've been asked this every single week, and I understand why. Like, Ryan Graves was above and beyond a failure last year. And I hate to say it, that sounded very harsh. He had a worst case scenario season. It was a rough year. It was his first year on a new team. He was, and I'm going to say this and some people aren't going to believe me, he was one of, if not the top defensive players on the open market last year for a good reason. He had good years in New Jersey. He had great years in Colorado. Is that player still in there? I would have to assume so. Is that player something that I could see the Penguins taking advantage of and see playing for the Penguins? That's a bigger question. Is he going to be able to assimilate to the system well enough to get to the levels that he was in New Jersey and in Colorado? Is he going to be able to get the partner that's going to allow him to unlock his truest potential like he did in New Jersey in that one year that he was really good with John Marino, or like he did in Colorado? I don't know. But I don't know if anybody's willing to take that risk on Ryan Graves after this season. You're selling very, very low. But again, I'm not going to rule it out simply because after seeing Kyle Dubas offload every problem contract the Penguins had in exchange for Erik Karlsson last summer, I don't know if I can believe anything is truly off the table. But I think that if there's something that is off the table, the closest thing to it has got to be Ryan Graves being on the move this summer. I think they want to see what he can do in his second year. I think they want to see how he can respond. And I think that the rest of the NHL is going to wait to see how he responds before being open to accepting that type of contract. I understand that everybody's pointing out the Utah nameless because they have literally no defenseman signed at the current moment, but they're not going to be looking to sign on a guy for 5 seasons and take on a contract that as of right now looks like an Alcatraz of a contract just because they're not looking to compete next season. This team wants to get off to a good start in a new city. Taking on one of the worst contracts of the 2023-24 season is not going to be a great way to endear themselves to fans. So I don't see that happening. Mac has a question here, says, do you think that the Penguins should sell hard if it's chalked at the trade deadline this year? If they're in the same position where they're fighting an uphill battle again to get into the postseason, I could see them turning and trading again like they did this year, trying to sell off their unrestricted free agents, anybody worth of value to try to get back, as Kyle Dubas tried to do this trade deadline, try to get back some prospects that are a little bit closer to the National Hockey League level. That way they can try to lower their overall age while bringing in some high upside talent that is at the, end of their development. But at the same time, I got to look at it here. Let me bring up Cap Friendly. I don't know who they're going to have to trade away. Like I mentioned at the start of the show, I would assume Marcus Pettersson is going to be locked up to a new contract. I would assume that that's going to be the case by the time the trade deadline comes around in March of 2025. And I would also assume that they're not going to be willing to trade a guy like Drew O'Connor. Now, would somebody else want Rickard Rakell with 3 years left on his contract at that point, if he's still on the team? I don't know. Would somebody want Michael Bunting with 1 year left on his contract? That might be an interesting name, but at the same time, if they're in the same situation as this year, and Crosby still looks like he can go, and Malkin still looks like he can go, and Carlson obviously looks like he can still go, and Letang still looks like he can go, and of course, the goaltending situation is going to be a whole other question. Do you really want to trade away Michael Bunting? Are you really going to be in a place where you want to trade away the one guy that does the thing that will help their overall goal scoring? I don't know. I don't think. Maybe a guy like Jesse Puljujarvi, but again, what's the value going to be? He's going to be on an expiring deal. He was a healthy scratch at points this season, so I'm not exactly sure who would be on the list for them next year. And of course, there's a lot that remains to be seen this offseason, Mac, but I think that selling hard is probably not going to be what they end up doing. I think they could end up doing exactly what they did this trade deadline if they're in the same spot. But at the same time, I also don't expect them to be in the same spot. Mitch has one more question, and this is one that he got a little bit more specific here. This is one that's not going to take me long to answer. Do you think we ever see Crosby move teams? No, we don't. He has been open for his entire career to the fact that he wants to play his entire career in one spot. It doesn't happen a lot in professional sports anymore. But this is a guy that learned at the heels and learned in the house of Mario Lemieux early in his career. This is a guy that absolutely loves what he has built in Pittsburgh and is not going to walk away from it. If he was to ever go to any of those teams, if he ever was to leave Pittsburgh, there are two teams. That's it. And everybody knows what two teams they are. Colorado to play with Nathan MacKinnon, or the Montreal Canadiens, because that was his childhood team growing up. And it's Canada. It is Montreal, Canada. So that's the only two teams that make sense. But at the end of the day, no. I would put it at a 99.87 because of superstitions, 99.87% chance that Sidney Crosby finishes his career in Pittsburgh. And if I'm wrong, I'll be one of the most shocked human beings on the planet. But I think he ends his career in Pittsburgh, and I'm not really concerned about anything happening otherwise. Austin said, you think Sid would save the franchise and keep the Pens in Pittsburgh like Mario did years ago if things got bad? I'd like to think so. I don't think things are going to ever get as bad as they did when Mario saved the franchise. It would be very hard for that to happen because they're in a much better position now. Everybody needs to understand the importance of getting that new arena, what is now PPG Paints Arena, how big that was to keeping the Penguins in Pittsburgh. When Mario saved the franchise, he saved it, right? Just because Sidney Crosby is going to go away at some point, Evgeny Malkin's career is going to come to an end, Chris Letang's career is going to come to an end, and the Big Three era is going to end, doesn't mean that they're going to get back to that point. I don't think it's going to be, especially in the hands of FSG right now, I don't think it's ever going to get to the point where they're going to need saving. Now, with that being said, when Sidney Crosby's playing career is done, he, as with Mario Lemieux, has earned the right to do whatever he wants. If he wants to screw off to Nova Scotia and play golf and just take trips around the world, he can do that. If he wants to stick around and be a part of the Penguins organization and be present and be visual, he can do that as well. I would like to think if things got bad, that Sidney Crosby and Mario Lemieux and it'd be an Avengers Unite of all the biggest Pittsburgh Penguins hockey players and stars of the past coming back to save the organization, but I don't think it'll come to that. But again, you said if it gets to that point, I would like to think that Crosby would do everything in his power to keep the Penguins organization in Pittsburgh. But again, I don't think that's going to be of much concern. Luke has one last question, and then we'll say goodbye for this episode of Tip of the Ice-Burgh Live. Thank you to everybody that's tuned in live here on Inside the Penguins and everybody that's listening back anywhere you get your podcast from. But Luke has one last question here saying, what roles do you see Sid taking on post-retirement with the Penguins? I don't know if he's going to take on a role. I don't know if I see Sid as somebody that wants to become a coach, wants to become a front office member. I see Sidney Crosby honestly just doing what Mario Lemieux has done outside of owning the Penguins. Play some golf, get involved in some charities that he cares about, and come around every once in a while to play in a charity game in Pittsburgh. I could genuinely see that happening. And if there's playoffs in Pittsburgh, I could see him coming back and being in the luxury box. But I don't know if, personally, based on what I've known about Sidney Crosby and what I've seen from Sidney Crosby throughout his career, I don't know if he'd want to become a coach. I don't, especially at the National Hockey League level or in the Penguins organization, I don't think he would want to become a scout. I don't think that he'd want to become a front office member. And I don't know what his thoughts on being in media are. That would certainly be a turn for being one of the most, I wouldn't say closed off, but being one of the most, I don't know how to put this, but being a player that is very much in and of itself to the side and keeping his life separate between hockey and personal. I don't know if I could see him making the transition to media and being around the game in that aspect. In that way, he does love the game. There's all these stories about he watches all the games, he watches the postseason, he watches the playoffs, he watches around the league during the season. I don't know if he'd go away from the game entirely, but I don't know if he'd come back in an official capacity with the Penguins organization specifically. There might be a role for him. I'm sure the Penguins would give him any role he asked for, but I'm not sure I could see him on the coaching staff. I'm not sure I could see him as a scout. If anything, I could see him maybe is, like I said, like one of those ambassadors of the game that the Penguins have had with some of their former players and their alumni over the years. So that's going to do it for this episode of Tip of the Ice-Burgh Live. Thank you to everybody for tuning into this one. Remember, you can find us on YouTube at Inside the Penguins. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff, or you can catch us anywhere you get your podcast from. But that's going to do it for this episode. We'll see you guys next time.